Good evening and welcome to tonight's Instagram Live. For us at Steps Travel, travel is not simply about places and destinations, it's about people, about meeting people, unplanned and often unconditional moments that create connections. The trust of strangers is the very essence of travel. The kindness of strangers is something that we're lucky enough to experience on our travels, and it reaffirms our faith in people. And in our series of conversations with explorers, historians, researchers and conservationists, we aim to further explore that the kindness of strangers and the positive nature of travel. And tonight I'm lucky enough to have with us Dr Ursula Weekes. So I'll try and get Ursula online now.
Yes,
How are
I'm
you?
really well.
Great. Well, Ursula is a leading art historian who specialises in Mughal art and culture. You studied history at Cambridge and then went on to do an MA and a PhD at the Courtauld Institute. After that, you worked for a number of years in the Ashmolean Museum. You lived in India for some 6 years, where you were on a research fellowship and teaching art or Mughal art at Delhi University. And you're a lecturer or associate lecturer for the Courtauld Institute. Have written many articles about it, and you're currently
That's
working
right.
on a book.
I'm working on a book that's simply called Mughal Court Painting. It's hopefully going to be a sort of go-to book painting in this sort of golden era between the 16th to the sort of end of the 17th century. Yeah.
Great. Well, we'll come on to that in a bit, but how did it all start for you? Where did your sort of love of India or Indian art and Mughal art in particular, where did it
already
all
had a
come from?
long history of a love of art, just going back to my childhood, dragged around museums. But in 2000, I went to India for the first time and just absolutely fell in love. Then a couple of years later, when my husband had an opportunity to work out there, we decided to move. And I had just finished my PhD at that point, not on Indian art. I really didn't know anything about Indian art then. But I applied for a postdoctoral fellowship, and my PhD work had all been about the first century of printmaking. So a kind of era of the 15th century that's akin to the kind of media explosion that we are also living in, when people just suddenly had access to images in a completely new way. So a very obvious connection in working with Indian art was to look at the circulation of prints and the way in which they were brought to India in the 16th century, and had a very profound impact, really, because Mughal artists found in them this incredible resource of ideas that they could repurpose for their own context and culture. And so that's how I began to work on Indian art, and then living obviously in India, traveling around, the rest is history.
And you said repurpose it. So did they use art in the formation of their empire and sort of developing the Mughal Empire itself? It's sort of similar to, like, I suppose, looking at the sort of 16th century in the UK, you've got Holbein with his painting The Ambassadors with Henry VIII, very sort of symbolic paintings.
Yeah,
were they similar in the Mughal art?
So they saw art as a major means enforcing their own ideology, particularly among an elite. What really matters when you want to establish an empire is that all the people who share in the kind of burden of government actually believe in the ideology you're presenting. It wasn't an art necessarily focused at a mass population, but very much focused within their court. And they did repurpose European art, because a lot of the art they initially encountered, art that was brought to them by the Jesuits. Akbar, the great emperor of the 16th century, invited Jesuits to his court, and they brought lots of art with them with the intention that it would kind of convert the Mughal emperor. But what they found in that was a whole lot of allegorical symbolism, things like halos or little angels tipping out buckets of gold, things like that. And they kind of appropriated all of those allegorical symbols to their own imperial image. And that is actually just a generation later under Jahangir, where he very carefully, he's creating, just like the ambassadors, as you sort of cite it, it's full of all these tiny details, you know, globe, and he's reoriented the globe standing. It's an atlas that was given to him by the English ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe. And in fact, even in one of Jahangir's greatest statement paintings, you even find a little portrait of the English monarch, James I. Right there. There's a sort of little line. It's called Jahangir on the Hourglass Throne. Jahangir seated, and he's handing a book to a very important Sufi sect, and just underneath the Sufi leader is an Ottoman emperor, and then underneath him is James I, and then underneath him is the artist, a self-portrait of the artist. And it's almost as Jahangir is articulating this idea. His name itself means world Caesar. Jahan means world, and Gir means Caesar. And so it's almost as if he's showing how the world is coming to India, and it's both an acknowledgement of significant networks globally, but also sort of saying, but he is not so worldly as to sort of need these people. His direction of, you know, his thoughts are towards the dervishes, towards this rule, because he is expressing the idea that he controls both. He's a ruler both in the heavenly reality as well as in an earthly reality.
So you mentioned Akbar, you mentioned Jahangir and religion. Were they tolerant? Were they reasonably tolerant? And how's that reflected in their art and perhaps in India today in terms of religion?
So Akbar famous for his policy called Sul-e-Kul. So the Mughals themselves were, you know, a Muslim dynasty that had originated in Central Asia, gained India in the early 16th century. But by the time you get to, Akbar himself is the first Mughal ruler born on Indian soil. He's born in Sindh in 1542, just at a very for the empire, and he inherits the throne only at the age of 13 in 1556, and then as he develops his own rule, he really wants to create an environment where every different community sort of has a sense of agency and belonging. And his way to do that is to create a very centralized empire on himself. And he creates this policy called Sul-e-Kul, which means peace to all. And he deliberately draws Hindus into his nobility, especially through making many marriage alliances with key Rajput allies. And so yes, this idea of tolerance is very important to Akbar. Similarly to Jahangir, but then actually later in the 17th century with Shah Jahan, already you see a more a stricter Islam being pursued, that then becomes very pronounced under Aurangzeb, and this is why, you know, Aurangzeb and the Mughal.
Aurangzeb was towards the end of the sort of the zenith of the Mughal Empire. Is that right? It's not my period. Sorry.
He's the last of the great Mughals, Aurangzeb, so-called great Mughals. And that really means when they had a real de facto power as emperor ruling. Then through the 18th century, their power really, you know, is caught up both in their own fratricidal issues of inheritance, but then also with colonial powers and the rise of the Maratha Empire as well. So yes, that there is this incredible tolerance that we see in the kind of like late 16th, early 17th century. And that's very much reflected in their art as they try to draw symbolisms from many different cultures, from Hindu culture, Sufi and Muslim culture, from Christianity as well. They also had Jains who were present at the court. There was sometimes closer, sometimes more tense relationships with the Sikhs in Punjab as well. But it is a very contested space in Indian intellectual thought and political life as well. So their tolerance, but then also in the later period, the fact that you did have Aurangzeb, who destroyed a number of many Hindu temples. That is also a reason why, you know, it's just been in the news that the government in India have written the Mughals out of a certain history textbook. I haven't followed it exactly, but yeah, it's very much an active debate.
And they travelled a lot around their empire, but where did the artists come from? Were they spread all over the Mughal Empire, or was there sort of one area that they all came from? And do we know much about them and who they were?
No, that's a great question. We don't know a lot about who they were, actually, because there's very little biography written about the artists in contemporary sources. What we do have is a lot of inscriptions on paintings that give us their names and sometimes details of where they were working and so on. So we know that Akbar increased the imperial atelier, the imperial painting workshop, up to at least 100 artists. And many of their names have little suffixes that came from, say, Gujarat. So, you know, you have an artist called Prem Gujarati or Surdas Gujarati. So obviously there was a little contingent of artists who came from Gujarat and were drawn into the atelier after Akbar conquered Gujarat in the 70s. Other artists, you know, we have one called Nand Gwaliori, so he came from Gwalior. Others who came from Kashmir. So in fact, the artistic atelier was almost like a kind of microcosm of the diverse. The same could also be said actually for Akbar's harem. You know, all the wives that he married it was in a sense one of the most multicultural environments within the court space. And then other inscriptions about family relationships within among the painters. So, you know, you'd have Basawan, who's a great painter of Akbar's reign, and just there's one inscription on a little portrait of his son in the royal lazy. He's holding up this little thing and it says son of Basawan for this artist called Manohar. So from that tiny detail we just know that was a very important relationship. Now it makes sense to look at those artists' work because there's a overlap between father and son in their work. So yeah, it was there's one of the most intriguing artists who contributed one painting to Akbar's great Ramayan manuscript that's in the Jaipur city palace. It's called Mandu Firengi, and Firengi was the term for a foreigner, and that's all we have is his name. But it seems like there was a foreign artist who is working there, and we do have a European jeweler called Hunaman the Frank, who we know made a golden throne for Shah Jahan. And there are all sorts of interesting kind of, you know, foreigners who go to the Mughal court. The first Englishman to go there was a guy called John Mildenhall, and he travelled with two other people. One was called William Leeds. I've forgotten the name of the other one. They had this incredible journey where they got into all sorts of scrapes in aid of being chased down by Agra in 1584. And William Leeds, all we know really is that he was a goldsmith, but a lot of goldsmiths at that time were also portrait painters. If you think of Isaac Oliver and what's the other guy called? His name's going out of my head. Isaac Oliver and Nicholas Hilliard, those great English miniaturists. I have a suspicion that William Leeds was a little portrait. That's why Akbar liked him. And he then, the last bit of the sort of record of him was that he was, Akbar offered him a position in his court. He offered him a wife and 5 servants or 5 slaves, and that's the last we hear of him. He spent his days then in Agra. I mean, Akbar probably gave him a Christian wife, and from the Armenian communities that there were in Agra, perhaps.
So you mentioned wives, you mentioned the harem earlier on. So how involved were women, either as artists or patrons of the art in the Mughal world, Mughal Empire?
Yeah, well, we have a few really intriguing little inscriptions on paintings that show some women were artists. Probably there's an artist called Nadira Banu, and the inscription, the signature, tells us that she was a pupil of Akariza. Now, Akariza was the head of an atelier for Jahangir when he wins. And then it also says that she was the daughter of Mir Taqi. And I was so thrilled a little while ago just coming across this reference to a very minor artist in Akbar's atelier, Mir Taqi. So it's obvious that she was the daughter of a professional painter. She's probably the closest to a professional painter that we know about. But there were one or two other artists who signed them. In terms of women as bibliophiles, as owners of libraries, as patrons of art, all the senior women really of the Mughal court were very, very intellectual women, particularly, if you like, the women that came through a Timurid Persian background. We don't have so much evidence for this among the Rajput women who, with the marriage alliances, but certainly among the Persian women, particularly the Banu Begum, who is the wife of Humayun, the second Mughal emperor. And we know 13 manuscripts that survive from her atelier. She also, patrons of architecture, really important. So just in one of my favorite little corners of Delhi is Humayun's tomb. And Humayun's tomb was actually, everyone says it was built by Akbar, his father, but in fact it was Akbar's, it was one of Humayun's wives who was responsible for that whole area. And then if you go just to the side, sorry, that's my dog. Sorry.
It's okay, don't worry. Don't worry.
So one of just to the side of Humayun's tomb, there's a bit that's hardly visited at all called the Arab Sarai, and the Arab Sarai, really important area that was a sort of marketplace, and we also know. Could you just take her away? Thank you so much. Holiday, so everything's new for our dog.
Well, thank you for taking time to join us whilst you're on holiday. That's very, very kind of you.
No, it's fine. We're in the Isle of Wight. Yes, and then just nearby as well, there's a fantastic madrasa that was built by a foster mother of Akbar. What a foster mother means is within the harem, they had this practice of creating very tight kinship relationships. So a prince wouldn't only be breastfed by his mother, he'd be breastfed by a number of very important noble women, and those women would be considered foster mothers then for the rest of the emperor's life, and their natural children would be considered foster brothers as well. So it was like this sort of big extended family. And Mahamanga, Akbar's foster mother, was responsible for a big madrasa and mosque that's in Delhi.
Okay, so you mentioned the madrasa in Delhi, you mentioned little corners of Delhi you've been to, Humayun's tomb, etc. Where else have you sort of travelled in India, and what have you been sort of some of the more interesting discoveries that you've come across?
Yeah. Well, I love.
Where do you start?
Yeah, exactly. Where do you start? I love traveling in Rajasthan, and we'll come to Rajasthan. But one of my favorite sort of exciting ventures as an art historian has been in Gwalior. And I love Gwalior. It's in Madhya Pradesh. So if you sort of go due south from Agra, you hit Gwalior. And there's this that is when Babur, the first Mughal emperor, visited there in 1527, he called it the Pearl of the Fortresses of India. And that's partly because the 15th century palace of Man Singh Tomar has this beautiful tiled facade. And I think for Babur, that really connected with his experience of architecture in Central Asia, particularly in Samarkand and so on. But I had helped some wall painting that survived in Gwalior, and I really wanted to track down this wall painting. And so I'd gone and I had a fantastic guide. We went all around the palace. I was scouring every inch of the wall for kind of evidence of wall painting, and there was nothing. But I noticed as well there were a lot of padlocks on good little, you know, alleys in the palace, and so I was sure it must be in one of these locked areas of the palace. And then finally, I got permission, Archaeological Survey of India, to go up onto the roof of the palace. And the roof line of the palace, first of all, has these absolutely gorgeous crenellations. Also, when you get right up there, you're right in these tiled facades. There's a gorgeous tiger, for example. There's another beautiful sort of banana leaf plant. And in one of the little kiosks that lines the top, they're called chhatris, there, stepping inside, are just this amazing ornamental wall painting that survives. And it was lovely, really, because my guide, who'd been a guide around Gwalior for over 15 years, he had never been on the roof of the palace either. So for him to be able to go up there, and you were talking, I think, in your introduction about the kindness of strangers, and for me that whole experience was one of the kindness of strangers as well. You know, the archaeological survey person, permission, but then all the people within that sort of palace community, as it were. And the wall painting was really interesting, and it, you know, it's just like a really bit of a puzzle for formation of Mughal painting a little bit better for me in some of my academic work. So that was really exciting. Gwalior is actually amazing as well, because you have these incredible Jain statues carved into the rock. You know, not quite on the scale of the Bamiyan Buddha, but these monumental sort of rock carvings which were brilliant. Yeah.
In our Steps Traveller magazine, you wrote a wonderful article on Ajmer. Is that, do you want to say a little bit about that, and sort of, and again, the kindness of strangers there? I think there was somebody who got you or gave you access to a part that was it a temple? I can't remember, that people aren't normally allowed to access. Yeah,
so I had a fantastic time in Ajmer. I've wanted to go to Ajmer for a really long time, and then I first went last year or 2 years ago. I can't remember exactly. And it was absolutely fantastic. Now, this Ajmer is right in the center of Rajasthan, and it was always considered a bridgehead for controlling Rajasthan, but actually on the intersecting point between a lot of the main kingdoms of Rajasthan, if you like. So, you know, you've got Jaipur that's more towards the north, you've got Mewar, Udaipur towards the south, and then more Jodhpur west. So, if you like, Ajmer comes in this little intersecting point right there. So to Akbar, it was a really important city, and Jahangir actually stationed his whole court there 3 years. And while he was there, he discovered this kind of pleasure valley just outside Ajmer, which he then renamed, actually. He renamed it to called Fountain of Light. And I've always wanted to go to this valley, and then I was put in touch with a wonderful person called Sanjay Singh Badnoor, and he, through his connections, we were able to get together a party. Even just locating where the valley was a bit of a mission, and so then we went out to this incredible valley, to this pleasure Gear built you know, deep in this kind of ravine, in the gorgeous countryside of the Aravalli Hills, just outside Ajmer. And one of the reasons I wanted to go to that, one of the most iconic paintings of all Mughal art, is a painting of the Emperor Jahangir embracing Shah Abbas, the ruler of Safavid Iran. And at the time, the itself is by an artist called Abul Hassan, and he writes on the image in tiny, beautiful little Persian lettering that the image was made as a result of a dream the emperor had while he was at Chashma-e-Nur. And in fact, it was like a talismanic painting, because at the time there was a lot of tension between the two empires, the Safavids and the Mughals, over the ownership of Kandahar. And so the painting itself is almost like this kind of realization of the idea of friendship between the two. And the Mughal court was absolutely driven by these kinds of omens and dreams. They were very important. It was a definite means of exercise of rule and so on. So we went out there. Then we had been up, I'd ridden on the back of the bike of the person who had, that Sanjay had arranged. And now this was a fantastic young man called Zishan Chishti.
Because you're encouraging your children to do something like that you probably don't want. But anyway, carry on, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, I was riding on the back of this motorbike. We were going over this incredibly bumpy, dusty road, and I didn't have a helmet. And, you know, I mean, there wasn't a helmet to be had. But then when we came back down off the out of the valley, we're going to drive around Ajmer to the shrine of Muinuddin Chishti. Now, this shrine is one of the most, or the most important site of Muslim pilgrimage in India. Muinuddin Chishti is 13th century saint, 14th century, like just on the cusp of the 13th, 14th century, and his shrine is there. And Zishan Chishti is a direct descendant of, you know, along with several thousand other people now, of Muinuddin Chishti. And so he has a particular access at shrine. So yeah, the motorbike ride was quite hairy coming down the mountain, but then it was super hairy driving around Ajmer, because he was driving so fast. I mean, like 50 miles an hour. We would come to a speed bump and he would like dramatically slow down. But the real thing was he took about 10 phone calls while we were doing this. He'd be driving at like 50 miles an hour, taking a phone call, one-handed, me on the back. So yeah, that was definitely not one to tell my kids about. But then we went to the shrine of Muinuddin Chishti. I must say, I found that one of the most moving experiences really of my life. I really loved the shrine there. It was packed full of people. This was, yeah, so it must have been in 22 when I was there, because it was just after COVID, and I hadn't had any real experience of being in a really tight crowd. But I mean, I remember going to the shrine and thinking, there's definitely no social distancing here. And I had this wonderful, huge kit full of roses and jasmine as my sort of offering at the shrine. And to get into the kind of central bit of it, you have to go through this almost Lilliput like door. So it was like desperately crouching down. I was told to keep the basket ahead. So you're sort of really crouching down, trying not to like get all the flowers knocked off by the roof of the little archway of the door. And then you suddenly go into the actual central place where the shrine is. And yeah, it was just wonderful.
So that's, as you mentioned Gwalior earlier on, where else, if they want to see some of the best collections of Mughal art, where else would sort of people listening, watching, go to?
Yeah, well, in terms of collections of Mughal art, I mean, there's one national museum in Delhi, and then also a library that I love visiting. In terms of just Mughal art, one of the best collections is in Rampur, which is a little bit outside of Delhi. There are wonderful pages from the Jahangirnama, which is the chronicle of Jahangir's reign. Then also down into Patna, there are fantastic, in the Naksh Library, which is a very important library. There's a wonderful Timurnama manuscript, which was made for Akbar, a history of his great ancestor, the Persian conqueror Timur. And Akbar was very interested in inserting himself and his whole into this long historical lineage. He didn't even go back just to the Prophet Muhammad, which was the standard thing of Muslim rulers. He went all the way back to Adam in the lineages that he created, so that he's this sort of ruler for mankind. But then art collections, I love the collections at Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur. They're not really Mughal collections, but there's the Rajput painting, the painting of Jodhpur itself is just second to none. And I think Mehrangarh Fort as a museum is absolutely wonderful. For many years, there was a wonderful curator in charge, the director of the museum, a wonderful man called Kani Singh Jasol, who died very tragically in a car accident recently. So, you know, I think they're really looking to, you know, that was a really big, you know, a tragic thing to happen for the museum, as obviously for his family, but for the whole museum. But I think there's a lot of new beginnings happening at Mehrangarh as well now. And Mehrangarh, incredible concept, both for paintings and for textiles. So I mentioned Sanjay Singh Badnor. He comes from one of the Tikhanas. That's one of the more minor rulers. So you had the Maharajas, but then you had the Thakurs. They're sort of, you know, seriously important landed rulers, or you know, just underneath the Maharaja, as it were. So his whole family connection is with him in Ajmer, and some of it's with his brother also in Delhi. But they send their things to Mehrangarh, to the conservation studio, to be restored there. And then they also have this incredible textile conservation studio, and well, in fact, they do have one of the most incredible surviving Mughal textiles of all, which is called Daldera. And this is a tent that was it's the only surviving Mughal campaign tent. And it's this incredible structure, large structure, sort of like 5 meters square or so, that has, it's all made of red velvet with gold decoration on it, and it has this like central component. You know, the lovely cusped arches that India is so you know, famous for, as it were. Within the architecture of the tent, within the structure of the tent, within the fabric of it, there's like an outer walkway colonnade, and then there's an inner section where the emperor himself would sit on his throne. So you could have the most important nobleman sitting just within inside the colonnade. So there's a sort of colonnade within the tent itself, is what I'm trying to say. So that's in Jodhpur, and that's an absolutely incredible textile. It's yeah, I mean, those kind of tents, because they're used on the battlefields until they're taken.
So I was just saying that textiles were the basis, or one of the bases of the Mughal wealth, basically. That's where the wealth came from, with their textiles, yes?
So the wealth for the Mughals came from, in fact, their real economy was based in the agriculture. Like, you know, it was two things really. They were exceedingly creating an administration that could tax the land properly, and you know, their empire was this incredibly fertile Gangetic basin. So the agrarian was fundamental, you know, roughly half their GDP. But then they had these incredibly valuable cash crops. So it was things like indigo, cotton, silk. And yes, under the Mughals, they developed their textile production. So the cotton production, I mean, when you read, there's this brilliant a sort of manual of Akbar's household that's written in the 1590s. And as part of that, there's a description of different textiles. And when he comes to describe, Abul Fazl's the author, when he describes all the cottons, he lists about 40 different kinds of cottons. And many of the most expensive ones were like water of the Ganges or dew of the morning, because they were just so light, and they had to be woven in the early morning dew or in the late evening when the temperature was particularly humid, because then you could get the fibers to sort of stretch that finely. And these malmal, as the highest ranking one was known as malmal, they were more important, they were more expensive than silks even. But yes, then you also have the development of silk production in Bengal, which during the period of the Mughals overtakes China as the major producer of silk. And so, yes, then the sort of textile trade of the Mughals was huge. But gemstones were a meal for them too. Although they never controlled the major diamond mines of Golconda, that was in the Deccan, and it always remained sort of just outside the beach. But, you know, as a sort of hub of gemstone trading, that was also an incredible aspect of their economy. Yeah.
So, and when are you going back to India next? Are you traveling there soon?
Well, I'm hoping I'm going to go in November on my own research trip, doing some of my own things, and then I'm going to be going.
Is that part of your book, or is the book will be done by then? Or?
The book will basically be done by then. I'm my next trip to go on the trail of Prince Salim and his friends. So Prince Salim is the name of Jahangir before he acquires the throne, and I want to go and track down various areas to do with his birth. He was actually born in Fatehpur Sikri, in the home. I was mentioning Muinuddin Chishti, the head of the Chishti sect at the time of Jahangir, was home in which he was actually born. His mother was sent there to deliver, you know, as an auspicious place of protection, as it were, to deliver the baby. So he was born in the Chishti home in Fatehpur Sikri, and that for a long time has been closed and has quite restored. And I'd like to, you know, go there, and then also travel down the Ganges to Allahabad, which is where he held his rebel court against his father and was an important artistic centre in the early century. So that's a bit of my sort of own travel and research things that I would like to do. And then I'm going to be going in February on a tour with Steps Travel. So I really hope anyone listening and who would like to travel will you know, come along too.
Well, thank you for that. We're about to publish very soon the itinerary on our website. But if you, in the meantime, if you've got any interest and you want to, well, I could speak all night to you, Ursula. Just fascinating. This sort of your recall of names, people, places, everything. It's wonderful. And that's what I presume it's like traveling with you. That you the same energy that you have, the same, and also your connections, as you said, but the people that open doors for you, and that's all important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anyone who's been with me in India knows that I've just completely come alive. I love being there. And I think, one of the things that's so nice about traveling with people is that you don't have to have all the conversation in one go. You know, you can have these conversations that are ongoing and you can come back to them. Things somebody will say or new places that you trigger ideas that you've got in it. And because I've been writing my book, so much of this stuff is in the foreground of my head. So yeah, I love that excitement of discovery. And I feel like it, as in teaching, leading a tour, it's a very dynamic experience where everyone's learning together. And I love that. And I think, you know, it's always something transformatory. And somehow even the things I love about traveling in India is nothing ever goes totally according to plan. You always have to be alive to the sort of, you know, things that are going to surprise you. I remember one day that desperately trying to get to Varanasi train station, and there was the most terrible queue, and I was stuck and I was feeling really frustrated. And then we sort of got to the front of it, and it was an elephant that was trying to walk down the road on the wrong side of the road, and I just thought, how wonderful, you know. So I love, and one of the things I actually really enjoy about leading a tour too is, you know, with the local tour guides that are involved too, you always have such fantastic interactions, conversations. So yeah, I find just the energy of being on a tour I love so much. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Well, we're very much looking forward to it next year. Well, in the meantime, we're also looking forward to your book. So when do you think the book's due out? Is it later?
I'm completely submerged in the like minutiae of footnotes, sorting that out at the moment, and also having to cut down my words. I had really hoped that it was all going to be out by the end of 23, and there's a chance that it'll be out by the end of 23, but I think it's more likely that as we're sort of going off on the tour in February, that it'll just be coming out at that point. That more, sadly, more realistic aim.
And that's Mogul Court Painting in India by Dr Ursula Weekes. So, thank you so much for your time tonight, especially on holiday, and I'm sorry for interrupting.
It's lovely.
But thank you so much, and it was an absolute joy to speak to you. And we very much look forward to February next year.
Brilliant. Thank you
Thank you
so much. Bye.